What's he building in there? What's he building in there? We have a right to know.
All right, welcome everyone to this week's episode of Reframing the Narrative. This one is Just Say No to Mind Control. And with that, of course, Jake, always good to see you.
Good to be here, PJ, out in semi nature, quasi nature, adjacent to nature, and enjoying the day and under a puffy cloud sky without trails of toxification. So today I thought we'd discuss basically something that a lot of our episodes have pointed to in the sense of, first of all, recognizing problems and then changing our mindset about them, the way we look at them. In other words, hey, we're called reframing the narrative. And once we have that kind of framework to work with, then what do you do? And so we've been talking about actions that people can take, whether big or small, life changing or just maybe adjustments that people make. And we've talked to a couple guests that are really walking that talk recently with David James Rodriguez and Ernest or Ernie Hancock as well, with more to come. So I was just mulling over these issues and was thinking, well, the way, especially we've been treated in the last 5 years, government itself is essentially a narcissistic abuser. And people that continue to feed it, just like maybe in some of the movies that we might be familiar with, the most immediate that comes to mind would be Gaslight, where the term comes from, or even something like Gone Girl. There's a whole bunch of examples in popular culture. I think The Devil Wears Prada is another one. What do you do when you're subject to narcissistic abuse? Well, we're going to discuss that. And it's not really an action plan. I think we're just going to have a conversation about that and put these things out there so people can take action themselves once they do recognize that government itself, and the term government derives from Latin and ancient French for control, direction, and ruling over the mind. So hence our title today will be Just Say No to Mind Control.
Yeah, and I think that's a really great point, Jake, about, it can be steps that are little or big, and they can be completely life-changing, but it's certainly one wouldn't want to try to do everything at once. It's extreme and it's not practical, nor is it scalable. But I think of, you and I talked offline earlier this week about someone that you met and someone who decided to get out of the system and now drives a bus around to raise awareness and is really living somewhat off the grid and really making a life within a community of like-minded people. And that's someone we hope to get on our show to get more of the story. But maybe, that's a great example that you can, just from the short conversation you had with that gentleman, maybe you can tell a little bit about what made that person motivated to unplug to some degree and then just go see the country and really connect with other like minds.
I went to a local area I like to go walk, and I parked up near an estuary. I noticed parked very close to me was a converted school bus with a lot of signs in every single window and on the back. Taxation is theft was one of them. Kind of the message was nobody owns you, and least of which would be the government. And I had the good fortune of meeting, I would say, the bus driver. And we had a great conversation. And I do look forward to inviting Chris was his name, and I'm sure he doesn't mind me using that name, on to the show so I don't have to put words in his mouth. But essentially, his impetus at withdrawing from the system. And again, I love to quote REM on this.
Withdrawal and disgust is not the same as apathy.
It's because you care a lot of times. You might want to withdraw from things that you recognize as getting in the way of who you want to be. And I think that's the case here. He was working a high paying engineering job, and the government was taking 60 to 70% of it in the form of income tax. And it wasn't just the point that he was losing that income to the government. It was, okay, I need to slave and arrange my entire life around this occupation. And the fact that the government kept most of that, if you're in a high enough tax bracket, without all the shelters that our friends on the top have, he just didn't find himself being himself. So he wanted to be more authentic, and that was the beginning of the pursuit. So one of the first things he did was start networking with like-minded people. I'd like to take a little segue, speaking of networking with like-minded people, and ask you about your experience recently at Confluence. Maybe you could tell us what Confluence is for those that don't know, and then how that was.
Yeah, and that's a great example of just a big gathering of a lot of people who have withdrawn to some degree or removed their participation from the system. And when I say system, it's the beast system, it's government, it's all of the above, but those attendees have made their own decisions in terms of how they define autonomy and how they live their lives and how they view the world. And so Confluence is something that it's definitely a collective effort. So I had volunteered and there were many volunteers there, but one of the main names that many people know, one of the key speakers is Alex Zek, but there were many others who were present, and even people who weren't presenting but are well known in the community were there. And it was really great to connect with people who, have seen behind the curtain and were open to hearing other perspectives, even if they didn't necessarily share them immediately. But I think when you come to a certain realization about the world we live in, then it's like, well, I was lied to before. Why would I not at least hear another argument? But I think, beyond just exploration of different ideas, it was a lot of people presenting solutions and communicating their learnings, whether that was through talks or whether that was through music performances or any number of different forms of entertainment. But I can say, I came away from that particular experience just really energized, because it's great to be around people who've made some type of decision to not participate and to really live and see things differently. And I can say that just in the short time I was there, for in effect a day and a half, that I made a lot of new friends and new contacts and people that I definitely look forward to seeing again next year. I will definitely be there, and our somewhat recent host, Michael Jaguar, will be performing there next year, and we look forward to being there to supporting him and being part of the community. But I think that just ties things back together in terms of the mind control and the system that's out there, that there is sometimes it's easy to feel alone, that you're the only person who sees things the way they are, or more clearly than, let's say, that's presented on the boob tube, or as Jake likes to say, the Talmud vision. And um, but I think that's where, even if you may have never thought of a specific solution or an alternative to any specific aspect of the system, there are many people there who may specialize that and can offer a new way of unplugging or doing something differently. But one thought that occurred to me as you were kind of recounting Chris and his van and his experience, it really kind of just, this remembrance came to me of, there's so many ways that you can say no to the mind control and the system. And one of those is just as we've talked about before, removing your attention, and more specifically, like even watching television, which is absolutely controlled by government and large corporate and higher level interests. And everything that you see on television is intentional and has a meaning. I forget where I heard this once, but the camera only points where they want you to look, right? So your attention, again, even if it seems like a little thing, is really powerful, and you can take that away. It's like what I used to say during the scamdemic, that I never got COVID because I turned my TV off. And that really was it. And I just had a conversation like this where I forget who it was who was saying, but it's like whoever I was speaking with at the time said, well, I just didn't watch TV during the whole time and looked around, and it was like, nothing's going on, everything's fine. And so that's just definitely a very powerful version of mind control that we have to remind ourselves of. And hey, I'll raise my hand. Guilty pleasures watching sports sometimes, but I do like to bring myself back to reality, that you're always being programmed, and they call it a television program intentionally.
Yeah, they sure do. I just thinking back to the scamdemic, I kick myself for never calling out some of the things I saw. I had in mind things I saw in the news. And one in particular, I remember almost picking up the phone and dialing to call out reports that there was like no morgue space in I think it might have been Boise. It was somewhere in Idaho. And I just thought, wow, I should call them up and say, I guess I couldn't come up with a fake story to get them on the line to answer me. And so I nixed the idea, but I really wish I had just picked up the phone and said, wow, how are you guys handling this? I'm just an independent blogger, and I'd like to know. Well, without lying, maybe I could have said something like that. But yeah, nothing was going on, except we were subject to this mass campaign of pressure from above that caused anxiety and caused people to behave differently towards each other, and mostly in negative ways. But then I think it also gave us an opportunity to pause and deliberately treat each other better when we did recognize that there was abuse going on. And essentially, like what we're talking about here, just say it ends with our circle here. We're not going to continue to call each other out for not wearing a mask or not standing on a circle on the ground or waiting in line to get into a store or whatever it was. And then, of course, the reverberations expanded beyond that. And maybe we chose not to patronize a certain chain or certain store at all. In fact, speaking of Chris, he was in what I would consider a free state for most of the time. And he said he ended up just pretty much only shopping or going to restaurants at like one establishment in town for shopping and one for restaurants, because he just put it directly to the proprietor, are you going to require me to wear a stupid mask? And they said, hell no, man. He had a more colorful response to that, actually, really a good one, which didn't involve profanity, but it was just like, what do you think I am, the government? It was really cool story. It ties into everything we're talking about, just being more mindful. When you are aware of what's going on, as we'd say in New York, what are you going to do about it? Are you going to walk away? Are you going to try and change things, or at least stop feeding into that? And you touched on something that's really important. It could just be something as small as limiting your exposure to certain communication, certain messages, certain devices, certain social media, or maybe just getting into the idea that there's such a thing as psychic vampires, people that just don't bring good energy. Maybe there's somebody in your life that all they can talk about is politics and you're beyond that. Maybe you don't need them in your life. And unless, like you said, you want to throw a ball in the backyard and they're the only one that has a decent mitt, then fine. But limit it to that kind of contact. So I think what we're talking about here is really scalable. It can be from little like micro actions and not microaggressions. It's a stupid term, but micro steps that we take towards just asserting ourselves to be who we are and be true to ourselves. And then all the way up to exit and build. And then all the choices you make with that.
Absolutely. There's where we can consent, and then I think the other side of the equation is where we're less able to consent, and I think we still have to make as good of choices as we can to counteract that. And I'm speaking very broadly here, but I think about things like spraying in the air, as you were just commenting earlier about, like, we have no control over that. However, we can choose to eat clean food. We can have clean water. We can do a number of things to counteract that and maintain our health. And part of the system, too, is to give us many temptations that are destructive in the foods we eat or the things we drink or whatever we do to ourselves. Like, there's no limit of ways to destroy yourself, and that's definitely part of an agenda, and something we could potentially go deep into in this episode or future one. All the ways to, as we've said before, open the door to the vampire and let it in and let it eat away at you. And so that's all, a consenting thing, but then there's all the external factors. And I think, from my point of view, the most you can do about that is raise awareness. And as we talked about with David Rodriguez, the one thing that we do have is numbers and power as a population. And if enough people stand up and say enough, then they have no choice but to listen. And so I think there's what the things that we can do in our own lives, and then there's the things that we can do to help others see. And enough of us come together, then we can't be ignored.
Exactly. I do think that we overlook our strength, and the power of just saying no shouldn't be overlooked. And in fact, we should always remind ourselves and anyone that's listening about the power of no. But one thing I think we should be wary of is the idea of petitioning for better treatment in our personal lives or when it comes to the government. Really comes down to just being consistent and not granting permission for this abuse to continue to be perpetrated, and then just letting it, man, I hate to think of this movie title, but there's a movie that's really controversial now because of some Hollywood scandal I won't get into, but it's called It Ends With Us. So, right, when you recognize something, you put a stop to it right there, and you don't perpetrate it. You don't echo it. You don't amplify it. You don't pass it on to the next person. You don't take the problem and hand it over to somebody else either. Like, well, I voted for that guy. It's his problem. So I thought it was really interesting in my interaction with Chris yesterday. First thing he asked me was, so are you an anarchist or a libertarian? Because that's an important distinction to him, and I think for this conversation as well, because a libertarian is still within this system where they're looking to others to fix things for them. They're just more about like, well, your system, it's okay as long as you don't encroach upon others. Whereas voluntaryism, which I prefer over the term anarchy because it's a loaded term that's been sullied over the years, kind of like conspiracy theorist, is essentially just everything is done according to free will and not treading on the free will of others, and always respecting the rights and the free will of other people, even if they're not there. And it's a very high moral ground to take. And so I don't know if the population in the condition that it's in is actually prepared for anything like that. But in in a world in which I was the author, then that would be the top requirement, would be the moral standards to recognize everyone's natural rights and respect those. And that comes down to just every single interaction you have. But it also comes down to just kind of filtering everything through yourself and going, did I agree to this?
And so, what would you say to those who think they can just vote harder to affect change? And the reason I ask that is there was definitely a fine line in a gathering I went to just this past weekend where I talked to a very broad cross section of people in, let's just say, the larger community of awareness, but levels of awareness varied. And there was definitely discussions about, oh, well, we're glad we've got our guy in. And, it's like many other things. There's part of you that wants to go, are you kidding me? Like, you can't vote harder. But, you have to meet people where they are. And, I just be curious, like, how much do you run into that out where you are, Jake? And like how, I guess it's situational and person by person, but what's your response to that sort of thing when you come across people still like they sort of get the picture, but then they're still thinking that anything can really change at the ballot box?
Well, I'm going to make light of this. So it's me speaking, and I'm trying to be facetious here, but I just reflect on myself. If you put me in a position where I'm in an office and I'm subjected to being lobbied by moneyed interests who also have the power of violent threat, the barrel of the gun, as Mao Zedong said, I can't even guarantee that I would be on the straight and narrow. I might just sell out. And again, I'm trying to be a little funny here, but how can you possibly guarantee that somebody that you vote for is an independent operator, only loyal to his constituents' desires? And that's impossible to know exactly what they want, right? Entirely, and you can never represent everybody. But then they're incorruptible. The only incorruptible force I know is the original force of all, and that's God. So how can you believe that it's your guy when it's not just your guy, it's your guy and all the people, all the forces that elected him, all the possible forces that can blackmail him and bribe him and threaten his kids, his mom, threaten to expose deals he's made or just make life miserable. You're not just voting for one person, you're voting for what they represent, how they got there, and who keeps them in there. And then somebody might whisper in their ear once they're already in office and say, no, you really can't do that. And I think when you do know somebody who's actually run for office and you are sure that they're of sound character, you can have a discussion with them about how things really work. And in my observation, and I do know some people that have been in office and are in office currently, they have zero traction with the machine. Like zero. I personally know somebody who introduces a bill every single week in the body in which I'm going to say they because I don't want to give anything away at all, but they introduce a bill every single week just because they need it out there. But does it get traction? Does it get voted on? Does it pass? Nuh-uh, because that acquaintance of mine is not connected. So try and affect any change without a machine behind you, and you're not going to be able to. So that's my point, is really like you're not just voting for a guy with good character, maybe somebody with nothing to lose who's already lost his wife, like Thomas Massey. Maybe he's independently wealthy and he's off the grid and he's got a water source and something like that. He's about as good as we can get right now, but that's 1 out of 100 guys, right? It's 1%.
Those are really good points. And as you were describing the person whispering in the politician's ear, I had an immediate flashback to Lord of the Rings with Wormtongue speaking in the decrepit king's ear, saying, "They're not welcome here." But I think that's very much how politics really works, and I think that there's plenty of evidence to bear that out. And you make a really good point too about, like, if you don't have the machines backing, like, you can introduce bills or say whatever or protest, and it's like nothing's going to change, right? If you're not in the club that we've talked about, like, you're not going to be able to affect anything in how society is put together and run and managed. And that's just something that I think a lot of people really haven't come to grips with. And also too, when we talk about the president of the United States, I think about Bill Hicks, i.e. Alex Jones, in his younger days. He had this comic bit about every president being brought into a dark room and shown a video reel of JFK, and said at the end, someone saying, "Any questions?"
When you win, you go into this smoky room with the 12 industrialist, capitalist scumfucks who got you in there, and you're in this smoky room, and this little screen comes down, and a big guy in a cigar roll the film. And it's a shot of the Kennedy assassination from an angle you've never seen before. It looks suspiciously off the grassy knoll. And then the screen goes up, and the lights come up, and they go to the new president. "Any questions?" Just what my agenda is. First we bomb Baghdad. You got it.
And those marching orders come from very high up in the pyramid, and definitely people in the club.
Absolutely. Essentially, like, everything could be a conspiracy, right? So we're facing conspiracies on every level that are out there. And for us, we just need a better conspiracy, right? We need to conspire. We need to work together. There's nothing wrong with the term conspiracy. It's just people conspiring, working together to aid or to move forward a common cause. And of course, it's got negative undertones, because otherwise you could just call it a plan. So, okay, if it's negative, it's a conspiracy, but we just need a better conspiracy. We need to out conspire for good. Like what Chris was talking about, it goes against who we are if we know that the nature of people who seek power is on its face not the kind of people who really should have power, deserve power, and they will abuse it. David Rodriguez made that point. Also Ernest Hancock made that point as well. Like, he made fun of the whole notion that they're above something like election fraud. And so if you know that people by nature who are involved in these things are abusing power at the very least, seekers of power, they're corrupt, you don't agree with their moral values or anything like that, how can you expect that system, which is populated by these people, to work for your goals and your aspirations and be in alignment with your values? There's no way. So just stop. It's not that hard, actually. I was going to say it's not that simple, but it's actually not that hard. It starts with no.
Really good points there, Jake. And another thing that I think about too, in terms of consent, and this harkens me back to this gathering that I referenced this past weekend, is there's like the mainstream, and then there's the alternative mainstream. And I got into a particular conversation where I reluctantly bit my tongue, but speaking of Bill Hicks / Alex Jones, it's like I spoke to someone who I think still believes that he's one of the good guys and was going on about various aspects of Alex. And I think that's another one of those checkpoints where it's like, have you figured out that he's part of the system and just putting these thoughts out there and saying crazy things to make the people who actually have been able to see behind the curtain look crazy, and to normalize, calling conspiracy, quote unquote, conspiracy theorists crazy, and that they, they're tinfoil hat nutters. No disrespect to the tinfoil hat podcast, by the way, but I think that too is like, that's another form of consent, and it becomes conspiratainment. I don't know how anyone could watch they're making the frogs gay and still think that this guy is like someone is steeped in truth and fighting the fight of freedom. Like, it blows my mind to see that, and like every crazy thing he's done, and clearly he was put out there as an example to, everything that happened with a certain incident that he had to supposedly pay billions in reparations for. Those of us with eyes to see know that every incident like that is a staged event. But of course, he had to be the fall guy for that. And it just blows my mind that there are still people who participate in that version of non-reality. I think you brought up a really good way of looking at it, Jake, which is just asking questions and maybe pointing things out rather than trying to slap someone awake and going, dude, you're still part of the system watching this guy and listening to what he has to say. But it's a slippery slope, though, because there are a number of people who are in the quote unquote truth community who are unfortunately compromised in some way. Even if they're saying 90% truth, they're sticking that 10% in there to lead you down the wrong path. And we've definitely talked about that before. So with participation also requires discernment, which has been a theme of ours in the past, and just really listening to what someone has to say, whether it's the extreme guardrail of an Alex Jones or someone on the other side that looks by most appearances to be one of us, but maybe throws in one or two questionable comments on a regular basis that you're like, what's this person's real motivation, and how are they self-funding themselves in the way that they are? These are all things we need to think about, and again, where we're paying our attention and what we're consuming.
Yeah, really good points. I think of it as infotainment. You said conspiratainment. I like that term a lot. And yeah, my video is lagging, but sorry, viewers, if you're watching this. But to tie your points back to the greater kind of vibe or energy that we're dealing with, even something like infotainment is kind of like a narcissistic abuser, in the sense that by listening to it and standing for it, we're perpetuating it. And unless we're taking steps to move toward solutions, it's just entertainment. What's the difference between that and just choosing your flavor of mainstream media? Like you said, the mainstream alternative media has really just become another gutter next to the bowling alley, the lane that people are just like, okay, I just bowled a zero and I'm just going down my gutter. It's the same thing to me. It all leads to the back of the alley, and you get swept up by the machine in the end because you're not taking action. So anything that just perpetuates you handing your sovereignty, autonomy, and discernment over to somebody with a nice microphone, or a studio, or an organization and a badge, something like that, is going to put you in the same place all over again. You're not going to make any progress towards the things that you recognize as better than what's going on, better than the way it is.
And I think too, with discernment and government abuse, one thing that I really wanted to touch on briefly, and it can definitely be a deep dive for another time, whether it's a discussion or with a guest, and or with maybe something I explore in the rabbit hole in the future. But I think it's really important to remind people that it's discernment comes with seeing through some of the big psyops that are put out there under the guise of freedom. And one of my favorite ones that has recently come to light with some really great investigation that Medicine Girl has done, but she's really uncovered the market behind the so-called my body my choice movement, that with abortions there's this whole fetal line of trading that happens in the black market, basically with government protection. And also too, it's an abuse situation to convince people that murdering their child is freedom, and that's a whole psyop that goes many decades back, but that's part of the abuse, and it's all given to quote unquote progressive people, that's your freedom to choose another life or not. We typically in society call that murder, but that's part of the abuse, is listening to that and participating in it, and calling it a right.
And it's incredible to go back to the origins of that whole making that kind of decision and that behavior acceptable. How do we even get there? There's one, it's a major expose that I'm working on. I won't even name what it is, but it, it kind of dovetails to that, because it's a certain behavior that society, particularly the Anglo-Western world, normalized. And it just boggles my mind that something abusive could just be so routine and so normalized. And like you said, for abortion, it's even become a rite or a ritual, which is even on, it's on this higher psychic level of people really not just consenting, but wanting something that is bad. It's bad for them. It's bad for society. It's not good for the body of the woman that does it. It's obviously the life is ended there as well. But it's it's incredible how things can be just inverted, and that's what we're talking about a lot on this platform, is the inversion of things. So when you see things upside down, you kind of just have to stop and say, "Wow, that's really backwards. That's messed up."
And also too, much of that traces back to ancient times, and even biblical accounts of children being sacrificed to Moloch. There's a lot of parallels to that, and child sacrifices happen throughout the millennia, and it's just been repackaged as some sort of new freedom and choice. But that again is where the discernment is really necessary for everyone to realize that these people in control, it's not a lot of people, like a first level of understanding in the truth journey is to think, oh, it's all about the money. No, it's not about the money. They print the money, they own the money printers. There's a dark agenda behind so much of what we see, and much of it is veiled, but much of it isn't. And the murder of another life is part of a sacrificial ritual, and people just have to be able to see that. And there's many details that we could provide. Again, that could be a deep dive for the future, but really just understanding that the people who have thousands or millions of viewers and they just end with it's all about money or follow the money, they aren't telling you the whole story. They're not giving you the full picture. And it really is up to you to look many levels deeper than that to realize that the power pyramid ultimately comes to intersects with the spiritual world, and there is a spiritual agenda at play. And there are dark forces that want you to destroy yourself and others, and that really is the bottom line. And it goes back to consent. There's a reason I keep bringing up the analogy about the vampire. Like, it really is, it's a dark force that you're letting into your life on many levels when you say yes.
Absolutely. Yeah, you got to let the vampire in. I think you made a really good point about the whole thing when you have a discussion and people talk about, well, it's the money. Well, yeah, for the lower level plebes, the people that need to have the skids greased to work for an agenda that they're probably not aware of. Yeah, money is a factor. Like, I probably have my price. I'll say that. Just I'm joking, but make me an offer, and I might be known to work for an agenda. It's got a very strong pull, the financial power, but on, like you said, the spiritual level, it goes way beyond the money. And the people that do run the systems, they just use the financial levers to get what they want. And that's one thing that really annoys me about Orange Man these days is he points to these issues and then he says, look at it, look at the UN, they're not paying enough for their dues. It's based in New York and we own the property, and Denmark should be paying more. And people get all riled up about things that have financial issues that have nothing to do with them, or even Doge, waste of fiat currency by some government agency that should never have been created. Okay, it's good to discover all these things, but the crux issue isn't the money. It's the agendas that they're spending the money on to get people to serve. For instance, giving money to some foundation in a majority Muslim country so that they'll do some kind of stage play promoting something that goes against the majority's values, like LGBT, QRST, alphabet agendas in Iraq or even Iran. That's not about the money, right? It's about their final goal. So it really annoys me when Orange Man says something about saving people money. It's irrelevant. It's really about the agenda. And yeah, cutting off those spigots of money will help thwart those agendas, but it really stops with just not promoting those agendas. It's very simple. It's the just say no Nancy Reagan kind of thing.
Well, yeah, and even like, speaking of the agenda, I've heard some people again in the broader community point to Elon Musk and Doge and like, oh well, he's doing some good things, and it's like, have you even looked into this guy's history? Like, he has never done anything in his life. He's stolen every idea and put his name on it. And then you look at his mother, and his mother, like, you can see all the examples of her doing the gang signs. It's well documented. She is part of the club, therefore he is part of the club. And this is not a good guy. He does not care about you. All of this is a show, like all of politics is a show. And that's what people have to realize.
Yeah, for sure. And his background goes beyond to his grandfather in Canada, who was really high up in a bunch of agendas, and they're not coming to mind in the moment, but you can look into it. It's more Canadian background than South African background, just to put that out there for anyone that wants to look into it. And I think James Corbett's done a bunch of really good exposés about Elon's background that have stood the test of time and are not colored by the current hype over Elon and his success with Tesla and being incorporated into this tech bro administration, elders of tech bro Zion that are currently at least visible in the seat of power. So I would encourage anyone to look into that, because James Corbett did that expose. I'd say, wow, probably 2019, maybe even like pre what I like to call the malarkey of 2020. And I've definitely referred people to those and listened to those myself. But yeah, just getting back to the whole idea of narcissistic abuse, it's just important to start by establishing clarity and saying, this is an abusive relationship, and then examining who is in control of it. And then if you cannot change that or you cannot control it, then what do you need to do? And the first step you can do is stop rationalizing the behavior of the abuser. And we've seen that over and over and over with people who feel like they've got their guy in there. You know, the whole Q thing, like, trust the plan, bro. That's rationalizing behavior. That's holding out hope for something for which there are no rational reasons to hold out hope for. There's no evidence that these guys are working for you. So we need to just say, okay, they're not working for me. That's okay. The system, it's not broken. It's working great, but it's not working for us. And that's where I start. And it takes a while. It took me a couple years to say, okay, I'm just gonna, I'll admit it. I'm not on the voter roll. You know, that's something about me for anyone listening. I just said it's not for me. I don't want to participate. I don't want to contribute to the energy and even just basically giving my stamp of participation in that system that doesn't work for me, and I don't think it works for my neighbor either.
Here. I couldn't agree more with all of those comments. And just as a clarification, Elon's grandfather was a member of or a founding member of the Technocratic Society, I believe in the 1930s. I think that's what you were looking for there. But the larger point was taken that these people are not in it for you. They're not in it for society. They're in it for themselves. And the ones that are higher up in the pyramid are in it for a much larger and darker agenda that will be largely veiled from the public, or as those in the Brother Man Club would call it, the profane masses. The profane masses will never understand the real agenda, simply because most of the time they choose not to look. They're distracted by Kim Kardashian or the latest NBA playoff game. And I'll throw myself under the bus for that one. But, you know, there's a number of distractions out there to keep you from looking into things that matter, and many traps to get you into consumerism, materialism, things that ultimately don't matter in our real purpose in life.
Exactly. It's just important to recognize that what moves the ball forward when you have a certain set of values, and maybe moves the ball forward towards the other team's basket. I don't know. But it is NBA playoff time. I'm a one sport guy, wearing the hat of a defunct team right now. But I think to kind of get to a conclusion of this conversation and circle back to what Chris, the occupant of the Freedom Bus or the anarcho caravan, was getting at, was he was in our conversation. He was all about trying to find people who are taking action as well, and it can be as simple as just bartering, paying cash. Other people who are not reporting to certain agencies of what they do, whether it's their behavior, whether it's just not asking permission and just doing what they're doing. And it doesn't have to be like this whole big movement. He just wanted to meet people. He's been at it for a while. And so it was instructive to me to take that message home just after our conversation was, man, I can just maybe introduce him to some people locally that are taking action, doing this thing. And that brings me to one of the traditional remedies for abuse, whether we're talking about government or individuals. There's 12-step programs, there's help groups, right? So if you're an individual and you're subject to, let's say, DV, you're very well served by finding other survivors, other victims, and withdrawing from the abuse, but finding self-help groups and forming a community. So essentially, that's all that we're trying to do here, right? We're trying to build this community. Yeah, once in a while, maybe we crack a good joke and we're interesting to listen to, but I really do hope to inspire action, first of all, from myself by constantly ingraining these ideas in myself and then hopefully rubbing off on others as well to take action. So I don't want to underestimate the power of building community, because something like Confluence, that's really a great example of building a community that's essentially a group of people that are saying no to the way things are and maybe haven't figured out exactly how they should be, but the first step is something that is not perpetuating this system that is designed to abuse and exploit.
Agreed. And I think in my closing thoughts for this week's discussion, there's a number of content creators I've been following recently in my nascent journey into entrepreneurship. And one really good soundbite that I've seen recently that's related to all of this is, really living a life by design, not a life that's given to you. And that's a choice we can make in our employment and how we support ourselves, but also how we participate in the system. And the system will absolutely design something for you if you don't design it yourself.
Awesome. I couldn't say that any better. I think we should just wrap up with that comment. Be the designer you want to be and design the life that you want to live, because no one else is going to do it for you.
That's right. And I think that's a good stopping point for this week. And I will just conclude by always asking our listeners to contact us and to be on this show. Speaking of Confluence, I had a lot of great conversations and am working on follow-ups to try to get people with names and not just some everyday people who have really good stories to tell. I'm going to extend this conversation for just a few minutes for people who haven't already hit the X button and said they've heard enough of this week's. But, one thing that was really in one of those Confluence conversations I had, and I apologize, I think I might have talked about this a little bit last week or recently with our conversation with Will, but, just going back to that idea of walking through the catacombs in Paris and looking at all the skulls around me and saying, each of those skulls had a story, and what's your story, right? Everyone has a story to tell, and that is just something that we would love to hear your story and have you on. And if it's just a conversation between the three of us, that's great. And if you have something really interesting to share, that's even better. But we have all of the email addresses and ways to contact us, so please don't be a stranger. Be part of our little internet community.
Totally agree. And we welcome all these conversations. I would even say, like, if you just have questions, even come on. If you just happen upon one of our conversations like this one and not everything makes sense to you, feel free to come on and ask some questions and share your experiences and how you got to this point. One thing that is always really helpful in conversations, instead of beating people on the head, is just asking them, how did you get to where you are right now and what are your thoughts? And that's what we want to know with any guest in the past or potential. So yeah, I just wanted to add that. You don't have to agree with what you take to be our message, because we're learning too, and maybe we can help you kind of hash things out and help us achieve clarity as well.
Amen to that. And with that, I would encourage our listeners to stay tuned, because we have a lot more coming in future weeks.
We sure do. See you next time.
You just have to flood a country's public square with enough raw sewage. You just have to raise enough questions, spread enough dirt, plant enough conspiracy theorizing that citizens no longer know what to believe.